Hello, and welcome to Infinity. I'm Charlie Seraphin. During the next half hour, we're going to be talking about clinical evidence regarding reincarnation. Our guest is Dr. Helen Wambach, a clinical psychologist who, after a long career in clinics, hospitals, and university teaching, became a pioneer in the field of research into dreams and the unconscious, and even into death. Dr. Wambach is the author of Life Before Life and Reliving Past Lives. These books have been translated into 13 foreign languages, which shows that there seems to be some kind of an international interest in the subject of life before life and reliving past lives. Dr. Wambach, welcome to Infinity. Can you tell us about your research, how it is conducted? When we get into the clinical evidence part of reincarnation, some people would think that might be incongruous.
True. Most people say there can't be any scientific evidence of reincarnation because there's no scientific evidence that there is anything in the human mind that can survive the death of the brain cells. So it's kind of an a priori belief that there can be no scientific evidence. I rephrased the question for myself. I knew that people reported past lives under hypnosis. The question to me was, can it be proved that this past life recall under hypnosis is fantasy? That, I thought, could be either proved or disproved. That's what I set out to do. When I first discovered that subjects under hypnosis reported past lives, I was quite intrigued because during my training in the Veterans Administration during the Korean War, I go way back, we used to hypnotize battlefield shock victims, take them to the scene on the battlefield that caused the trauma, get them to relive it under hypnosis, and then find that the neurosis that was caused by the battlefield incident dissipated. We never thought these men were lying. We assumed that when they went back to the battlefield experience, it had actually happened. When I discovered, as much by accident as by any plan, that using hypnosis was the way to get people to go back to traumatic experiences, I found that these traumatic experiences were often reported as being in past lives. Now, logically, that seemed to me impossible, but they behaved exactly the way the battlefield veterans did when hypnotized. It seemed to be the same process. I was working with kids who had dropped acid and had bad trips. This was in the 60s in a hospital outside New York in the suburban area. And in desperation, what could we do with these kids who were doing the drugs and having these wild trips? I decided to try hypnosis with them. I said, look, I know a nice, free, safe, legal way to trip. Don't drop acid, come into my office, I'll hypnotize you, we can explore those same areas. And it was there that I discovered the reports of past lives. I, of course, assumed that it was fantasy because my philosophical worldview at that time was very much based on scientific materialism. I was a pretty normal clinical psychologist for my age and stage. I must say, I think it's the young people who changed me as much as anything. And at first I thought, well, only kids who dropped acid had past lives. Well, at that time I was teaching at Brookdale College, and I was teaching experimental psychology, and I asked for a group of volunteers of sensible adults who did not do drugs, who would work with me on seeing whether or not they reported past lives. So my first effort was to find out whether this was a phenomenon caused by the drugs or whether it was a universal phenomenon. I found that all my subjects who were sensible and adult and drove the freeways and paid taxes reported just as many past lives as the drug kids did. So I said, well, this isn't a cultural phenomenon in that only people who've read about it are into it. It seems to be fairly universal. Then, of course, the thought occurred to me, as it would to you, well, if the hypnotist is suggesting a past life, and hypnosis is suggestion, it's not very surprising that people would report a past life. Mm-hmm. I began to chew on the problem. What is this phenomenon? At first I thought, well, I'm suggesting it, they're getting it. Maybe past life recall can be a projective test. Maybe you can find out what people's needs and desires are by getting them to create a fantasy about a past life. I thought, well, maybe this will rival the Rorschach inkblot test. I'll have a new projective test. So, in order to establish how I could use it as a test, I realized I needed at least 3 past lives from every subject. It's easy to interpret one past life as representing somebody's needs, but in the field of personality testing, you have to have more than one example. It has to be a consistent theme. So I took 40 subjects, hypnotized each one of them to 3 past lives, and discovered that I could never predict what their second past life fantasy would be on the basis of their first, or the third on the basis of the first 2. It didn't work like projective tests. A subject might be a woman at a ball. In the first regression, I say, okay, there's a need to dress up and so on. Might be a peasant male in Turkey in the second one, and might be a primitive native in Africa in the third one. Well, how am I going to string these together to make up personality needs? So at first I was discouraged and said I can't use it as a projective test. Then I began exploring a little further. I kept approaching the problem and then backing away from it. I was very busy as a psychologist at that time. This was purely a hobby. I was running one of the first group homes to be established in the country, and I was very involved in community mental health. And I did this on the side, more or less as part of my teaching. But I kept coming back to it. And when I took 20 subjects to the time periods 1200 AD to 1900, charted when they were alive and as what, and when they were dead, I was trying to get a pattern. Is there a kind of pattern? I discovered that quite a few of my subjects reported being born, watching chickens peck in the backyard, and dying of summer diarrhea at 4 or 5. I got all these little childhood lives scattered amongst these years, especially up until 1700. I said to myself, that's weird. Why would anyone fantasize being born a child and dying a child? And I looked up the statistics, and I found that my subjects reported about 50% of their lives were over by the age of 5 or 6 in the earlier time periods, and that indeed this was a statistical probability. That's 50% death in childhood. This was my first clue that somehow or other people could accurately report the past in past lives rather than reporting fantasy. I then worked with a few good individual subjects, took them to past lives where I could research all the details. Under hypnosis, asked them such things as the name of the police chief in a small town in the early 1900s, and worked extensively on one case where I got 23 bits of data, details of life in that town, and found out that in that town there was a newspaper that was microfilmed, so I had something to research. And I went about that. I call it the Bridey-Murphy approach. And I found that about 80% of the details did check out. A few of the details didn't, or I couldn't find information on it. But then I thought to myself, maybe my subject could have heard or read about life in that small town, forgotten it consciously and reproduced it under hypnosis as a past life memory. And indeed, I found out that the aunt of my subject had lived in that town. There was no evidence that the aunt had discussed the name of the police chief in 1910. Nevertheless, there remained a logical possibility. And I realized that there was no way to prove reincarnation by going at an individual case by case. This is the notion of how you research past lives. But I found it unsatisfactory. And my experience with these children dying and finding that the proportion of my subject reporting was the same as the actual proportion gave me an idea for a large-scale study. So I did just that and hypnotized 1,100 subjects, because the first thing I determined was the number of cases I needed to make a statistical case, and I knew I needed at least that many. Then I set up the hypotheses that I would test. I reasoned that if past life recall was fantasy, number one, I'd have more historical figures reported as past lives that I knew could be possible. 7 Cleopatras or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
The second one was, I assumed that in our culture we have a notion of the past based on Cecil B. DeMille movies, history classes, that I would get a picture of the past from my American subjects that reflected the common cultural fantasies about the past that we know of. So I set up 12 different hypotheses about what I would get in different time periods. For instance, I chose 1700 because I thought I'd get pilgrims, Thanksgiving-type pilgrims.
Turkeys. And
yes.
friendly Indians.
Right. I set up hypotheses for each of 5 different time periods. I chose 500 BC because I thought I'd either get Egypt, which is popular in the occult world, or Greece, because that's about all we know about in 500. The fact that there were a lot of Chinese around and other cultures is pretty much unknown by us. So I set up these hypotheses of what I would get if people were going to reproduce the past as we envision it now in our conscious culture. Then I set up a series of hypotheses based on archaeology. I know that archaeologists have evidence of pottery, types of food eaten, types of goods sold in different time periods. To sum it up then, I had 17 different hypotheses of what I would get when I regressed 1,000 people was common fantasy, and contrasted that with known facts about the past not ordinarily available to people. I then tested the hypotheses and discovered that every single one of my hypotheses was answered in terms of the real past and not the fantasy past. This, in essence, was my original research, and it still blows my mind.
Not everyone is a hypnotic subject.
Oh,
you
yes.
talk about. You said you picked 1,100. Did you get regressions from each of those original 1,100, or did you have to go through 1,300 to get 1,100 that would work?
I find that about 10% of my subjects who were hypnotized in a group and who answer these questions not out loud into a tape recorder, but instead recorded on a data sheet written out when they wake up, that 10% do not get past life impressions. 90% do. This figure is quite stable over many groups, and I've now done it for thousands. When I took that 10% who didn't get a past life in the group situation into individual hypnosis, I found that I could get all but 2% under in reporting past lives. The distinction is not whether people can be hypnotized. This is a notion that we've had in this culture for a long time. My method of hypnosis is just putting people into rapid eye movement, which is the dream state of sleep, and all of us can do that.
So you have 100% success rate?
Well, no, not
hypnosis?
100%. And you must realize that my subjects are motivated to do it, or they wouldn't show up to do it. So I've obviously got a bias there.
Okay, let's talk about some of the specifics then of the research after you had these people hypnotized. Are men's experiences in past lives different than women's?
No, they're exactly the same. Their conscious attitude towards it is quite different. I'll have a couple show up for a group session. The wife has read all the books on reincarnation, is very into it. Husband thinks it's nonsense. Everybody lays out on the floor, including the husband, and he gets into rapid eye movement quite easily. And on awakening, his wife, who is very tense and doesn't get hypnotized, that is, doesn't go into the dream state, has no past life to report, and the husband's scribbling away like mad. He still doesn't believe it, but he's got a beautiful data sheet full of details on a past life.
Is sex retained through the past life experience?
No. This is quite a remarkable finding. Every one of my subjects who's gone to 3 or more past lives has switched sexes. Women are much more pleased that they were men in a past life, and men are quite ashamed that they were women in past life, but that's conscious attitude.
In the research that you've done, have you been able to determine whether the people who recall past lives seem to have been reincarnated at the moment of death, or is there a period of void in between one life and the next?
The average period between lives in my original study was 54 years. However, that depends on the century. Oddly enough, in this century, there is a much shorter time between death and birth, averaging about 4 years. I assume that the difference depends on the number of fetuses available. During the Middle Ages, when there weren't very many, the periods between lives was longer. I think that in the world of the unconscious, in the world of the spirit, time doesn't exist as it does here. So that becomes something of a meaningless question.
If you would hypothesize that the time between reincarnations is less now because there are more people, there are more possibilities for human life now, that would seem to preclude a reincarnation on another planet or in some other life form other than the human life form.
That's as long as we stick to our notion of time. You understand, our concept of time depends on the cellular being born as a baby, dying as an old person. That's the only version of time we personally know. The other version is the Earth rotating in space. That's the other time. Now, obviously, if you're not in a body, then bodily time frames don't matter. As a matter of fact, I'd like to offer you an idea here, Barry. And that is, when you dream at night, you're in a timeless space. You could be in your childhood home at one moment in the dream or in the office next Tuesday. In that timeless kind of mental functioning, we spend at least 1/3 of our time on Earth in sleep time, which is timeless time. We may indeed be traveling other planets while our bodies are lying quietly at home in bed. I don't know how we'll get rid of this feeling that we have to measure everything by hours and minutes instead of by psychological time. But I think we should.
Brings up an interesting possibility that we could be living on another planet, and 2/3 of our time on the other planet would be in dream time, which makes up for what we consider the reality of this planet.
Yeah.
What you originally started out to help people with this experimentation, to try to help people with drug problems or whatever, personality profiles and that sort of thing. It evolved into something else, and yet I'm sure that the underlying thought of how can I help people deal with their realities or their perceived realities in this lifetime and this time and space comes through. What kinds of experiences have people had? Have you helped a lot of people out? Have you sent anybody to an institution because of remembering experiences in a past life?
This makes me feel shy because I've been a psychologist so long and I've seen cures come down the pike constantly, from Freudian analysis to Gestalt. And I always said, I have no idea if this does anybody any good, and I don't want to know. I wanted to get away from that notion of doctor-patient, cure, not cure. I have had quite a few people tell me, years after having had the experience of being regressed to a past life, that the most meaningful thing was the death experience. That somehow after experiencing it under hypnosis in this dream state, they no longer feared it. It broadened their perspective in an unusual way. A good many therapists are definitely using past life recall as a therapeutic device to get rid of phobias and fears and so forth, help relationships. And there's quite a lot of evidence that people do report improvement in symptoms. I did a survey of all the past life therapists that I knew of doing the work to find out what percentage were experiencing cures. And it ran about 62% of their patients reported improvement. Now, this compares favorably with other modes of treatment, but doesn't mean that we have a miracle cure here.
You said the death experience is a very important one for the people that have been through this. I'm wondering about the life experience. There's such a big movement in this country and really around the world right now to change the way we have babies, change the way that new lives are introduced into the world, natural childbirth and that sort of thing. I know that there are a number of psychologists who have long felt that the birth experience messes a lot of people up. Any thoughts on that based on the research that you've done?
Well, babies certainly dislike being extruded into the world and having bright lights and cold. This is their major complaint on birth. It's cold, the lights hurt my eyes, and the people here don't know what they're doing. They feel lonely, especially if the mother's anesthetized. I'm here and she's not. This was a result of 750 subjects taken to the birth experience into this life. I wanted to know if people are reincarnated, and if we die over and over again, what are we doing back here again, and why? So I conducted a second research experiment on taking people to the period just before they're born. I wanted to know, does a giant computer say it's time to get born? Does God say front and center you? So I ran what I call my Gallup opinion poll of hypnotized subjects and got their answers while they were in the dream state. And I discovered that most subjects agree to be born, but somewhat reluctantly, rather the way you might agree to join the army because you get drafted otherwise.
Okay, if I have to.
Yes. People thoroughly enjoy dying. 95% of my subjects thought it was just wonderful to float above their bodies, see the body down there, and be totally free of anxiety and pain, floating around in bliss. I found no hell at all. I just found this nice detached feeling at death. But boy, do they resist being born. The feeling was, yuck, I've got to narrow down my consciousness. I got to function in that little teeny body. I got to grow it up. I got to go to first grade again. Ugh.
Well, I guess there's a certain helplessness associated with being born in infancy and those sorts of things. What about family members? Do we ever, or often, or sometimes or never, stay in the same families in different lifetimes?
Yes, we don't necessarily stay in the same families, but we often know the same souls who are perhaps part of a family. I find that in the earlier phases of incarnations, there is more likelihood to stay within the same tribal framework. As the world grew more sophisticated, and as the soul gains more experience through different lives, there is a stronger tendency to move towards new experiences. But it's very rare life where we don't know at least one or two important souls that are part of our lives now.
I thought of a question about abortion, which just sort of popped into my mind, and I think I'll ask it. The reincarnation experience is generally thought of as that moment of being born, as opposed to that moment of being conceived.
I thought that too. You see, I'm pretty good because I thought of all the questions you did, and I went around and asked all these hypnotized subjects. I said, when does your consciousness fully join the fetal consciousness? I said, are you in and out? Are you experiencing inside the fetus, in and out, outside the fetus? When do you fully join? The answer was most people are in and out of the fetus, and 78% do not join until just before birth. And about 6% don't join until a little while after birth. This surprised me quite a lot. I thought it'd be neat if the Supreme Court used this evidence to decide when a fetus should be aborted, but I'm sure that evidence from the unconscious is not yet admissible in courtroom.
And since you're dealing with percentages anyway, you have 20% or something like that
yes,
that
most
would be
of those
considered?
join in the 8th month. I thought that when life quickens and you can feel the baby kicking, in the 4th month would be my most common response. But only about 8% reported being in the fetus fully. A few, about 4%, reported being there almost from conception. But in each of these cases, they had died suddenly and traumatically in a past life and were really clinging to the fetus. One of the reasons why the period between lives is so short in the 20th century is that I measured cause of death in each of the 10 centuries from 2000 BC to the present, and discovered the 20th century's got to be the most violent of any. More people dying. And as a result, there seems to be more confusion in the between-world state.
You talked a little bit about your attitudes when you, scientific objective when you began the process? You came out here and stayed in California for a while and went through a metamorphosis of sorts.
Yes, your average California lifestyle change.
I'm wondering what kind of impact your research has had on you personally, and if you can put it in spiritual terms.
Well, I started out as a pilgrim, disguising my interest to myself as one of scientific rationalism. I discovered that what I was seeking to do was to understand my own dreams and my own intuitions and feelings, to see whether or not they were unique to me or shared by many others. I was impatient with religious dogma, been raised a Presbyterian and not a very ardent one. I was impatient with the Protestant Catholic division, with what I saw as the divisiveness of religion. I thought science was a better way. I discovered, however, that science led us into strange paths. Science is basically the dogmatic belief that the left logical brain can figure out the world and arrange it satisfactorily and provide happiness. I think we have living proof today that's not true. I became an agnostic about science. Then I became an atheist about science. And when I hypnotized all these people, and they all told me the same story, regardless of their conscious belief, when they are in their unconscious, I get exactly the same kind of death from everybody, regardless of whether they believe in heaven or hell. And I said, Jung was right. There's a collective unconscious, and there is truth there. And it is a one truth that supersedes all cultures. And I said, that's what I experienced. Then I had to go through another rather traumatic experience. I died twice on operating room tables within the last year and a half, and experienced personally what it's like not to have your body function and yet to be vividly aware of everything. So it's no longer...
You were clinically dead?
I was clinically dead. I had cardiopulmonary collapse on the operating table. And, of course, it's a good place to die because they revive you.
Mm-hmm.
But I did have the death experience, and I was aware that I would rather stay dead, but I had work to do. I think of being still alive here as staying late at the office, have to hang around. A lot of rather difficult things lie ahead for not only this culture but the world, and I feel under some pressure to do what small bit I can to talk about what I have discovered, which might help other people through a very difficult time.
We know how you feel about the science and the scientists and what has come before. How do they feel about you? Is there a problem in, trying to take a scientific type word, is there a problem with the objectivity of the information that you've gathered because it comes from people's subjective, subconscious minds?
Well, of course, I state that's what it's from. I'm not pretending that this is, God said.
Mm-hmm.
I am simply stating this is what happens when I get people into rapid eye movement, which is 8.3 cycles per second on a brainwave scale, and is a nice, neat, organized way of getting people there on purpose to test hypotheses instead of waiting for a psychic to drop to that level and say what comes through. Most scientists are not very interested in my work. Some of them are. I've gotten the most extraordinary letters from as far away as the South Pole, biologist on the survey station down there. A good many physicists have written to me and have experienced this. Physicists seem much more open to new hypotheses about how matter works than are, say, physicians who are working at the supramolecular level. So I will say that I have found much more acceptance for my work than I ever believed possible when I started it.
This is Infinity. Remember to keep your mind open and listen to your heart. I'm Charlie Seraphin. Thank you for listening.